What's up guys, it's GM Max here, and we're going to learn how to play the King's Indian Defense as black. For those of you who are wondering, the King's Indian Defense is a system where we play knight to f6, we put the pawn on g6, the bishop on g7, and then we put our pawn on d6, and then after the move knight to f3, we can then castle our king. These 5 moves signify the King's Indian Defense for black. It's important to understand that you can't play the King's Indian Defense against absolutely everything the opponent does, because if they were to play the move e4, for example, well, then knight f6 is going to run into e5, and your knight's going to get kicked around, and that's going to be a little bit annoying. And if you were to play a move like d6, and then to go knight f6, and then g6, well, when white has got this e4 move in without the pawn being on c4, it's not the King's Indian Defense anymore. Instead, it's the Peerage Defense, and that's a subject for a whole other video. Speaking of which, you make sure to smash that like button so I know what videos to create for you guys next up. Alright, so the game shows a very big advantage of the King's Indian. This game is between David Navara playing as white against Baskaran Adhiban in a Mr. Dodgy Inline Invitational for Chess 24. It's a blitz game that shows you that the King's Indian cannot just be played against d4, but it can also be played against other first moves like c4, knight f3, and other unusual moves. The only move against which you can't really play a King's Indian is against the move 1e4. So it's a very good all-in-one defense, saving you have to bother. It means that you don't have to worry about learning how to play against the flank openings, because you can just play King's Indian against it. The way that Adhiban did in the game with knight f6, knight c3, and now g6. And the principle is that once they get the pawn e4, you don't want to usually allow them to go e5 and kick your knight around. So by playing d6, we stop them getting that e5 push in. And after d4, bishop g7. Okay, of course there are a lot of moves other than knight to f3 that white can play. But the general principle to keep in mind is that if they don't play the move knight f3, or can't play the move knight f3 anymore, then the move c5 tends to gain somewhat in strength. For example, let's say white plays the same iteration with f3, and then the move bishop to e3. It turns out you can actually play the move c5 even as a pawn sacrifice here, because if they do take that pawn, well, it turns out that you actually get very good compensation on the dark squares, where you can go knight c6, bring your knight around to d7 and e5 and start to use your lead in development in a quite dynamic way. So it's a long theoretical line that is quite reasonable for black. But the good thing is the King's Indian is a very flexible opening. So let's say if you didn't want to sacrifice a pawn with c5, well, you could play the move a6 and go for a setup like knight d7, c5 and b5 and play it in more of a Benoni Benko style in that way as such. So there's always good alternatives for black when it comes to King's Indian. Also other moves like if they play, let's say, bishop e2 and go for an other bark system with the bishop g5. Again, c5 tends to work quite well if they put the bishop on g5, because if you're able to trade off that pawn on d4, then you sort of get rid of white's center to some extent. And if they do play d5, you can transition to a decent Benoni with e6, where you're going to take on d5, and that open e file is going to give you quite good counterplay to make up for white's space advantage. So it turns out that when playing King's Indian, you can also play it like a Benoni, in fact, in many cases. Now you're wondering, well, Max, if you're not going to play c5, what is the plan B? Well, we're going to see this in the game, because after castles and bishop e2, Adhiban played the move of e5 in this position. And the key point to keep in mind of e5 is that it is not blundering a pawn, because if white does take on e5, and then plays, let's say, queen takes d8, takes... we're actually going to see this structure in the game, actually, but if white does play knight e5, well, it turns out it's not a pawn grab. Can you guys see the reason why knight e5 would not be the best move and what black would play in reply? So make sure to comment below with your move that you would play in this position, and also subscribe for more of my Grandmaster Chess video content. Well done if you came up with the move of knight takes e4, discovering the attack against the knight, because knight takes e4 and bishop e5 would give black exactly what he's dreaming of in the King's Indian, to bring that King's Indian bishop on g7 to life with a wide open diagonal. Unfortunately for white, he doesn't have the intermezzo of knight takes f7 available to try and win a pawn, because we can hit him back with a counter intermezzo of bishop takes c3, checking the king, so that after takes, we can take his knight for free and not lose our knight to knight takes e4. That's why it was important to throw in bishop takes c3 first. So since d5 is not winning a pawn, therefore white should play a little more quietly. If he plays a move like d5, the plan of a5, and then bring a knight towards c5 to pressure that e4 pawn, it's going to give black very good play here. So, and in the long term, you're going to eventually try and get an f5 push in order to attack that e4 pawn even more, and then go for an attack on their king for when they castle short. Well, in the game, Navara played the move castles, and Here's where you have actually quite a bit of a choice. The main move for black is to move knight c6, the Mar del Plata variation. However, I found that when I was playing the King's Indian as a junior, my results in these lines were very bad, because even though I knew the plan of going f5, f4, and charging the pawn storm, some of my opponents always seem to know the positions a little bit better. So since I found these positions very uncomfortable to play as black, I'm going to show you a different way to play that allows you to play in a little bit more of a strategic fashion and kind of keep that tension in the center a bit longer. I've also recommended the move e takes d4 in my course Grandmaster Secrets to King's Indian. I'm going to include that link in the description below for those who want to get the full course, where I go much deeper into King's Indian than is possible in this one video. But here we're going to look at the move of knight to a6. And knight a6 is a move that might look like it breaks a lot of opening principles, like you're putting that knight on the edge of the board. But that knight is not going to stay on the edge of the board. Once white plays a move like d5, or a move like d takes e5, that's going to clear the way for us to put a knight on c5, hitting that pawn. And then when they defend it, then a very thematic move is a5, which is just going for a very dark squared strategy. You can see with the pawn a5, we're not letting white get in that move of b4 to challenge our knight. And in the meantime, if white were to play, say, bishop g5 and, say, bishop e3, well, we can play moves like b6 and go for knight g4 and f5. And that's going to give us very good counterplay, where we can still go for the pawn storm attack on the king's side that we see in the Mar del Plata, but where in first we manage to hold up the king's side play, and that gives black very good counterplay here. Hold up the queen side play, I should say. Actually, it's one thing I noticed actually when you talk to like grandmasters like Verov, like they think so many moves ahead, they're already talking like some move that's like move 6 their calculation. I meant to say move 1, so it's something you might have noticed with other GMs you watch. There's also move rook e1, and rook e1 is quite a good move that I do think gives white a very small pull. But then the move bishop g4 is quite interesting, where you can play to go takes on f3, and then try to show up that white's a little bit weak on the dark squares. And its approach hasn't been played in many games, but I think it might be better than its reputation, and certainly one way to avoid the mainline theory of c6 and bishop f1, which seems to be very good for white. So instead, bishop e3, that's the main move, and certainly the most natural square for the bishop in these lines, because on g5 you're often going to get kicked with h6 at some annoying moment. And here is where I have a little shortcut to share with you guys, because in the old days they used to play either c6 or the move knight g4 to harass the bishop, but Adhiban played the modern trend of playing queen e7, which I know has been played by various King's Indian experts like Gawain Jones, Lorraine Fressinet, and now Adhiban plays it as well. So the point of queen e7 is that you're preparing the move e takes d4 in order to discover an attack on the e4 pawn, and we see the queen is putting some nice pressure there. And if white were to play a move like d5 to try and deal with it, well, now we can play knight g4, and after bishop g5 and h6, we kind of get a somewhat better version of some other lines that you can get here, where if white were to play the bishop back, say, to d2, well, we can go edge 5, we can put the pressure on this pawn with e4, and we see that some of white's pieces like the bishop on d2 are not really very well placed. You'd much rather have that square for a knight if possible. And that sort of allows black to get good counterplay like a knight f6, and, you know, at this point, like, even going for, like, eventual f4, g5, g4 is pretty thematic in these sort of positions, but you can also kind of keep them guessing for a bit as to what plan you'll go for. Because sometimes you'll be able to take on e4 and hit the pawn this way as a possible plan B in this particular position. I guess it's more critical for white to go bishop h4 though. And I have to admit this line is probably a little bit better for white, but black's position is nonetheless very playable. For example, you can go for the move f5 and, well, on the one hand, after takes and bishop takes, well, white does potentially get a very nice outpost for the knight on e4, but we can also play moves like knight c5 and try our knight to f6 to fight for control of this square. And with the extra space that black has on the king's side, he can prepare to push those pawns down, and I think black does get decent King's Indian counterplay. So I wouldn't take too much into the fact that the engine gives white some preference here. Like, it's sort of a common thing in the King's Indian that often the computers will overestimate white's advantage in different positions. And there are also a lot of games in the King's Indian where you can have a bad position and still win the game, in fact, in some ways more so than a lot of other openings. So it's kind of quite forgiving if you do make some sort of mistake in that sense. Still, you're going to have practical chances to attack their king and turn the game around. Well, Navara played d takes e5, and the idea of d takes e5 is that if black was able to get a knight to d4, he would just be laughing and would just be a lot better here. But Navara played the move knight d5, kicking that queen around, and you don't really want to play knight takes d5, because after cd5 your knight really is misplaced on a6 then, and the pressure on that backward c7 pawn is going to be quite a pest. So queen d8 avoids that problem, and, you know, again, knight e5 is not a threat when we are going to take and discover an attack on the knight on e5. Navara played the move bishop g5, but I think that queen c2 is probably the better try, if white wants to fight for an advantage. You know, after knight g4, definitely you are going to be able to kick the pieces back and get some of your time back that you lost. But I do think that white probably is still a little bit better if he plays all the best moves. But instead we had bishop g5, and now Adhiban came up with a very fresh idea of knight c5 that I think just completely neutralizes this bishop g5 pin, because we are threatening to take that pawn, and now after knight f6, this is how Navara played it. We had a whole bunch of exchanges, you know, captures, 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 and captures. But actually bishop takes d8 I think was a mistake in this position, because with the exchange you're helping that black rook get to a much more active square. I think that you should probably play the move bishop takes to e3, and kind of accept that after knight takes e4 and knight e5, it's just a symmetrical and quite balanced position. Okay, maybe black has a little bit of an initiative with rook e8, and still you can play for a bit of an edge. But objectively, I mean, white is very solid, so it's not going to be so easy to win from here if white continues playing well. But we do get some chances. But after bishop d8, the general principle in these structures is that it's very comfortable for black if he's able to trade off the dark squared bishops, and the other point is that in this position, black has a very good positional move. You know, if you want to test your positional understanding, this is a good moment to try and figure out the best move for black. So well done if you came with a move bishop g4. The idea is not just to pin the knight, but actually we're going to take off that knight with, say, king f1 takes. And what you're going to see here is that after a move like c6, that knight is just ready to come to a very beautiful outpost on d4. You know, we've stopped white from being able to really take over the d file. And once that knight gets d4, we can just play on the dark squares. And we see that the white bishop is completely constricted by the pawns on the light squares here. And that's why black would be substantially better at this point. Still, this might be an improvement over what happened in the game, because after knight takes e5, this is the move Navara played. Adhiban played rook on the 7th rank, money in the bank, with rook to d2. And after bishop f3 and rook takes b2, surprisingly, I think this position is already lost for white. And the reason I say that is because once black gets that bishop on e6 and kicks the knight away, that c4 pawn stays unnumbered. The game continued with rook f to b1. Again, probably not the best move, but I think that white was already struggling. Black, well, at least that white managed to trade off this annoying rook, but after bishop e6, we see that it's very hard for white to avoid just losing that pawn on c4, because white does have some isolated pawns, and, well, you would like to go bishop e2, but then your e4 pawn is on. So the game went rook d1. Black played the move king to f8. Quite reasonable, even if maybe I would have put the king on g7 as a slightly more active square. White played a3, we had king e7. You know, Adhiban's just taking his time, sort of waiting to get his king to a good square and keeping that f6 move in reserve, knowing that the knight's not really going anywhere. So after h4, black played rook d8, and it's of a general principle. I find that the rook endings do tend to give white the best drawing chances, accepting opposite card bishop endings on average. So by trading the rooks, well, if white avoids the trade of rooks, black just gets the open d file for his rook. But when white does trade, it means that, well, in a position like this, the extra pawn's going to be much easier to convert without the rooks on the board. The game concluded with h5, king to e7. White now played h takes g6. And after h takes g6, at least for the moment, f6 runs in a knight to g6 here, but unfortunately for white, the danger comes from another angle with the move king to d6, and that is just completely lost for white. The only safe square for knight is g4, but now after takes, we see that black gets the dominant knight versus the bad bishop. I mean, you could even safely play move knight takes e4 here, actually, because you are going to be able to defend that knight with the king as required. But Adhiban's king e5 is also completely winning. After f3 and king d4, we see that what really decides the game is not just the domination of the knight over the bishop, but also the fact that black's king is so much more active than white's. And of course, it doesn't hurt that we have an extra pawn here as well. And Adhiban won the game just by charging his queenside majority forward, realizing that basically after king f4 and king to d4, that white is just not able to get his kingside counterplay in time. That black's pawns are going to be faster after king g5, a5. It's sort of an interesting exception, actually, because you guys might know of this principle that, you know, when you have the competing passed pawns, that the bishop will often be better than the knight. But here that doesn't apply because A, the black pawn is so much faster, and B, the knight is actually stopping the white bishop from getting back to stop our pawn on the b file. So game ended f4, king takes e4, just collecting the harvest, and then g3, and now king d3 was quite a nice move as well, just not allowing that bishop to kind of get back easily. Game went f5, b3, king takes f7, and okay, at this point after gf5 and bishop f5, now the key move of knight to e4, just not allowing that bishop to come back to the defense. And if you do play a move like bishop e6, trying to meet b2 of bishop a2, well, as simple as just knight g5 and just get rid of the bishop, queen the pawn, and win the game. Well, the game ended with king e6, and this actually sets one final trap, actually, which, well, Adhiban managed to avoid. If black had played the move b2 without thinking, then actually, after king e5, white would save the game, because after b1 equals queen, you'd have bishop takes e4, and white would then pick up the queen with the skewer. Fortunately, if Adhiban did not fall asleep, he played the move king d4, and then there's just no way for white to be able to catch that pawn with the bishop, and therefore Navara resigned. So there you are, a very fun game showing how to play the King's Indian defense. We've seen how it can be played from a lot of different move orders, that it's not just limited to playing against d4 and c4, but you can play it against the other first moves for white, with the exception of one e4. And then from these positions, we saw how Adhiban was able to go e5, how he was able to basically put pressure on the e4 pawn, and basically in this way get a very good game and win very convincingly against the top GM. So in that case, well, you now know how to play the King's Indian. Good luck in your own games. Do make sure to like that video so I know to make more how to play videos like this. Comment below with what you learned from this video to help you to apply it more successfully in your own games. And finally, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more of my Grandmaster Chess videos. So I'm going to see you guys in the next how to play the video.